city runs on paper, wax, and nerve. Before dawn, one Clark Hess seal decides whether beer reaches London and herring gets its salt, or trade grinds to rumour. When the sound toll bites, barrels sing, and a Revel ship is late by 3 tides, does routine hold the line? Or does the Baltic rewrite the deal? Quick gut check. If you had to save one thing in a storm, weights and L's, standards, the pilot list, or the tally sticks, what keeps the league alive? Drop your pick in the comments, then watch how the right answer pays everyone back. Where are we, and what time is it? Lübeck, the Hanseatic head, before the bell, dawn light over the Rathaus arcade. On the desk, seals, tallies, the Wagers standards, and complaints that keep business ordinary. Today, we chase one late cog, one creeping toll at Helsinger, and one small fix, corrected before key, that prevents a season-long feud. If you love sharp logistics, medieval ops, and quiet power moves like the video, share it to your history crew and subscribe for deep dives that respect facts and deadlines. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next convoy. You begin before the bell. It is a habit, not a virtue. In the thin blue light over Lübeck's roofs, you lift the bar on a door whose iron strap squeals unless you press the plank in with your shoulder at the hinge. The room smells like the Baltic when a storm has only threatened. Tar, hemp, old wood. A chest against the wall holds wax cakes and ribbon. A smaller coffer holds seals wrapped in felt, each seal with its own small temperament. The way a crack in the matrix catches. Wax. The way a careless twist can smudge a coat of arms into a meaningless blur. On the table are the tools that make a northern city intelligible at a distance. Knives, rulers, pounced parchment, a horn of sand for drying ink, a handful of smooth counting stones. You do not light the lamp yet. The window faces the street, to the Rathaus arcade, and dawn is enough to see where last night's tally ended. You work for the merchants as a breed, not for one master. Some call this room the Contours Bureau, though the League's foreign contore, Bruges, London's Steelyard, Bergen's Briggen, Novgorod's Peterhof, are the places where Hansa power bends the local market. Lübeck is not a foreign outpost, it is the convening head and the ledger that remembers. Your table is a crossing. Letters from Bruges asking for Lüneburg salt to cure clothier's herring. Schedules from Bergen requesting coarse cloth and rye. A temperate scolding from London about the gauge of barrels that arrived last quarter. A winter list from Novgorod, counting wax by the stone and fur by the bundle. People who love maps would say this is geography. A clerk knows better. It is routine stretched over water. The city wakes like an account. Columns, headings, predictable entries. The bell at St. Marianne marks the hour. The weighhouse opens its counter. The Wagermaster lifts the cover on the city's standard stones. The Mark and Fund waits that settle quarrels by sitting still. Out by the Trav River, a shipwright knocks a dowel into a seam on a cog, whose bow looks forever surprised, and a boy brings him a pot of hot pitch. The cog is the League's workhorse, a single mast with a square sail, broad beam, high stern, short keel, a little castle for a skipper's pride, and a place to shoot from if the Baltic turns rude. You could draw one with your eyes shut. Clinker, planks like fish scales, a steering oar that responds slowly and forgives as much, a deck that smells of salt, tar, and memory. Before the first customer knocks, you read yesterday again, because memory is the only way you keep promises from becoming. Stories. In Bruges, the alderman wrote that the water at the Ips and Rye can be sluggish. They ask that Lübeck remind its skippers not to jam the quays with late season arrivals. In Bergen, the Bergenfahrer, those merchants who live by stockfish and weather, sent a list of cod weights and an irritated question about a disputed ell of cloth. The measure in Flanders is not the same as at home. Your job is to make two lengths agree. From London, the English Afara enclosed a polite threat. If our beer arrives in barrels that break their hoops again, we will insist on our own cooper's inspection before unloading. You copy the complaint into your register with the same hand you would use to list the day's saints. Complaints are sacraments if they keep the trade ordinary. The door opens to a hat rimmed with frost and a voice that announces Travemünde with its salt wind still on the consonants. The skipper sets down a leather bag and tips a spill of wax impressions onto your table. From the river, he says, and fishes for the letter that matches them. 3 small last of rye, you measure bulk by last. Not quite a number in your head so much as a capacity you feel in your shoulders. 8 tons of beer bound. For London, 2 lots of Lüneburg salt bricks for Scania's herring, and a bale of linen, declared without blush, as if bales travelled on honesty. You pair the wax to the names on your list, each stamp a face you know. The merchant with the patience of a winter. The widow whose husband's ship did not return after Michaelmas 2 years running. The guild of Schonenfahrer who keep watch over the Scania herring fair and listen for the first rumour of shoals along the Skåne coast. You press your own seal to the skipper's paper, not as a flourish, but as a hinge. Cargo under our city's law now. Cargo that will be accounted for on the far shore with a matching mark. If you trace one commodity all morning, you learn how. A league is braided. Salt is easiest, because salt insists on being everywhere. Your ledger gives it 3 faces. The Lüneburg salt that rides the Stecknitz Canal on narrow barges. Men pole them through locks and shallow cuts, cursing politely when wind pins their hats. The coastal pan salt from farther west, cheaper and coarse. The small, bright crystals that come as a curiosity with wine from the south. You inventory bricks by the pallet, but you remember them by the people they feed. Scania's autumn market where herring runs like liquid silver and needs salt the way a fire needs air. Bergen's drying racks where stockfish turns hard and clean. Even London, where a dockside fishmonger will swear at you if brine stains his wooden tubs. Somewhere upriver, men hack peat and split brush to feed kettles. The Stecknitzfahrt carries the white bricks to Lübeck's warehouses. Then you watch as pallets walk themselves, on men's backs, to quays and into the bellies of cogs. You know the sound of a good bill hoop when you tap it. The barrel is everything when your trade is liquid. Beer to London, wine back north. Oil when somebody's ship has wandered too far south and remembered olives exist. A barrel with false staves steals from the buyer, but a barrel that fails steals from everyone. A hold of beer soaked into planks is a winter rumour fit to topple agreements. The Cooper's Guild is proud and prickly. They keep their own stamps and their own inspections. You stand between that pride and a buyer's sulk like a translator who learned both languages before he learned to count. In your registry, you note which Cooper's marks met complaints last season and which met silence. Silence is the goal in this employment. Past the doorway, the city parades its predictable hazards. A cartwheel breaks on the stone near the Holsten gate and the carter sings out 3 words everyone knows for such events. At the Wager, 2 men argue whether a sack is larded with moisture, and the weighmaster reaches for the standard stone without moving his mouth. He sets it in the pan with the gravity of a bishop. In the Rathaus Hall, a scribe drafts a letter to a town on the Gulf of Finland that wants Lübeck law, Lübisches Recht, so its merchants can speak the same legal tongue when quarrels want to turn into reasons to stop buying. You are proud of law, even when it bores you. It is the way a measure stays what it says it is from one harbour to the next. The winter letters never travel alone. They carry weather in their commas. From the Peterhof in Novgorod. The river closed 2 weeks earlier than last year. Wax came in lumps that shed crumbs, a sign that somebody was too quick with heat. From Bruges. Loans are tight because the clothiers' fares were timid. Remind your men to write precise figures on bottomry loans they take on their hulls, you call them bodmerai, so that when a mast snaps in a squall, the arguing about general average can be fought with numbers, not knives. From Bergen. Warn your skippers about ice on the way out. A Dutchman came in late with a hull that sounded like a drum when you knock it. Good workmanship and good luck, and a look on the skipper's face like someone who has looked at the underside of a frozen wave. By mid-morning, your hands have the grain of the day in them, wax on the thumb, salt grit on the cuffs, paper dust on the web between fingers. You write receipts with the neatness of someone whose letters will be read in poor light by men who have every reason to mistrust ink. You copy a charter party for a ship that will carry rye to Bergen, listing the obligations as if reciting prayers, who bears the cost when the wind sulks, who hires extra hands at the score, who pays for the pilot who knows the sandbanks near Bornholm, and the way a fog can walk like a person across the sound. You sign your name as small as you can bear, and leave room for the skipper's sign, a knife scratch that he has practiced. Because pride tastes good when it is written. You could spend the day in the harbour and learn as much as in the office. The key is a grammar of marks. Before a cargo loves a destination, it belongs to a sign, a paint daub, a carved rune, a branded letter on a barrel head. You have taught boys to read those marks before they read phonetic letters. A boy who cannot find his master's device on a stack will never keep a ledger's column straight. Along the quay, the men who do not get noble adjectives make the city durable. Rope sellers with palm-calloused hands who can splice a line in the dark. Scarra-men from Norway who hawk coils of dried fish in a language you meet in your ear before your mouth. A man with a scale hung from a spar who can tell you what a basket of onions weighs in a way that agrees with the wager within a breath. You think in roots because roots are where trouble and hope collect. A line north to Bergen brings stockfish and pitch. A line west to London brings tin and cloth and quarrels. A line southeast toward Prussia brings wax, grain and stories. About Teutonic knights who talk like ledgers with spears. A line east to Novgorod brings furs, honey, and the feeling that you are counting on a winter that may change its mind. Your ledgers carry those lines as if they were weather maps. When pirates, Vitalienbrüder, had their season, you answered with convoys and with letters to towns that promised to fly the same banner when prey turned into fleet. You do not mention knives often. You account for escorts like you account for pilots, as if courage were a line item that can be billed and paid. The city's money is quiet the way good bread is quiet. You count in mark Lubish and shilling and, under your breath, in debts that are older than coins. You do not balance ledgers by will. You balance them because measures agree in different rooms with different men. In a chest in the Rathaus is a set of standard weights and a metal L-rod. The beadle brings them out when quarrels fatigue everyone. If a Dutchman swears by Amsterdam stone, you do not correct him. You set the Lübeck stone beside his and let gravity decide which one has been spoken of more politely, more often. The city keeps its standards in oiled linen as if they were relics. In a way they are. You break for meat and bread when the tower bell tells your stomach what it already knows. In the beer house, the talk is boring, which is why the city survives. A skipper complains that the Suntoll has grown teeth again. Denmark's king decides some years that all traffic through the sound should remember him. A carter says the new paving near the Burgtor shakes wheels. A Bergenfahrer tells a joke about a cod that began to argue with a priest. A boy says the winter rye is bitter, and hopes aloud that Poland will be generous in spring. You listen because next week's letters hide in jokes. Back in the office, you open the tin box with the tally sticks. You were taught to trust a tally not for romance, but for the way wood speaks the truth with its jagged split. When you pair halves, one kept by the merchant, one kept by the contour, you are holding a promise that neither ink nor memory can forge by itself. In the afternoon, you will match tallies to receipts, then tie them with twine by voyage and season. Summer, England; autumn, Bergen; winter, Novgorod. The bundles sit on a shelf like a mild army, ready to testify when a dispute tries to become a feud. The Rathaus runner appears in the doorway with a leather packet tied with red ribbon. The Hansatag, the League's diet, has sent the minutes of last quarter's session. Lists of towns present, the stubborn hesitation of a city that will not promise ships next spring, the precise language of an agreed embargo against a prince who pinched a Hanseatic factor in his port. You copy the relevant passages into your book, with the duty of someone who knows that policy begins as handwriting. Law for you is not shouting, it is compatibility. If Rostock reads the same sentence you read and sighs the same sigh, you will both load salt onto decks without having to say out loud why your prices agree. You write 4 letters of advice before the afternoon lengthens. Each will travel folded under wax to a different weather. To Bruges, the barrels from Evers and Sohn. Past Cooper inspection, expect the beer. To London, the dispute about cloth measure settled at our Wagi. The L will be carried on the bill as your L. To Bergen, the rye you asked for is booked on 2 hulls rather than 1, because the wind has behaved like a vendor with an opinion. To Novgorod, the wax shipment is delayed by ice, but the tallies show no short measure. Expect to count to the ounce when the river loosens. You keep tone like a weight, never too light, never heavy. A sentence can sour a route for a season. Sometimes you go down to Travemünde to watch ships step from river to sea. The Trave widens there. The light changes its mind not by hour, but by thought. A pilot stands on the quay with his hands behind his back, reading the channel by the cock of gulls and the way the current writes itself on piles. You watch him climb, aboard, talk to the skipper for 10 breaths, then point with 2 fingers as if steering were a grammar he cannot explain, only speak. Men on the pier tell you stories about Flodeweigen and about a sandbar near Bornholm that eats keels the way. A book eats afternoons. You write none of this down and remember all of it. The day narrows to the time when a city remembers its wood. In your bureau you sort seals, rubbing a bit of oil on the matrices so the wax will not pull at old cracks. You check the strings for weakness. Hemp that frays takes a letter with it. You sharpen the knife that cuts paper so the edge is clean. A ragged edge tells a reader that a clerk somewhere was tired, and you cannot afford to sound tired to men who sail into fog for a living. You count the counting stones back into their pouch. A missing stone is an argument you do not want. Beyond the window, the street changes voice. Wheels stop. Footfall turns to the scatter of people finding beds or benches. On long winter nights, the watch calls the hours and snuffs lamps when taverns forget the time. Fire is the enemy. Water is the ally. You keep a list of which houses along your street have buckets ready and which households hold grudges about whose bucket is borrowed. This is not commerce, you tell yourself. Then you remember the night a blaze almost leapt the lane and a man threw his own ledger out the window into a snowbank with the same motion he would use to save a child. You write buckets on your list with a dot beside it to remind yourself to ask the beadle tomorrow about the condition of the hooks on the Rathaus loft. Sometimes the only drama in your day is a ship that does not arrive on the hour you thought. A cog from Reval is late. She carries flax and a bundle of letters from towns that like to remind Lübeck that it is only first among equals. You measure the lateness as a number, 2 hours past a tide turn, and as a texture, wind under the eaves without teeth. You lay your hand on the window frame to feel whether the air is sinking. You tell yourself a skipper's proverb. In the sound, a good pilot is worth a saint. You add a line to tomorrow's to-do. Consult the pilot list. Make sure the men who know the sandbanks are going where the sandbanks will be. If you squint, at your life, you could call it boring without insult. You stamp, you count, you translate, you listen. You keep equivalents alive across miles and different mouths. You balance coins by the way they ring on a wooden board. You rub wax between finger and thumb until its warmth tells you whether the impression will hold. You take someone else's promise in Hamburg and make it true in Bergen by putting two halves of a tally against each other and smiling when the teeth kiss. You look at a list of barrels, C8, and hear the complaint that will arrive if one fails. Your neck tightens, and you send a boy to the cooper with exactly the tone you save for telling a saint a small truth. You have watched a city grow rich on patience. It does not thunder. It insists. It insists that a mark on a barrel head means the same thing in Bruges as it does in Lübeck. It insists that a boat from Novgorod must reckon with the Citywagen in precisely the way a boat from London must. It insists that Lübisches Recht can settle a quarrel with fewer bruises than a dockside adjudication. It insists that a clerk's neat hand may be dull in a poet's ear, but is the method by which winter is kind. And yet, even in a city of insistence, you feel the edges creep. Denmark's toll at the Sound grows ambitious in some reigns. A prince in Prussia develops sudden principles about who may buy wax from whom. Bruges silted up one year and made proud men write letters that smelled like damp. You are old enough to know that channels move and that merchants follow water. You sharpen your knife, oil your seal, fold the day's papers into packets, and lock the chest with a key that looks like the letter G, trying to decide whether to be a fish. Out in the dark, the missing cog from Reval does not arrive. You wait before you let the worry enter your ledger. Worry is a number here before it is a feeling. 2 tides late will be a letter to Travemünde to ask whether the pilot saw a square sail east of the point. 3 tides late will be a polite inquiry to Rostock. 4 tides late will be a message to the Hansetag that says what you always say. When wind and wood hold conversations you cannot hear, as of the sexagenary day named, a vessel did not make the expected mark. The line is simple. What it means is not. If a city's wealth is the sum of its boring agreements written on paper and stamped in wax, what happens when the water on which those agreements rest moves under you? A toll rises, a channel silts, a ship is late by 1 tide too many. How do you decide which promise to honor first? The one you sealed, the one the pilot swore by, or the one the wind writes on your window in a language you were never taught? You learn to measure uncertainty by how the harbour smells. A dry, tarry morning means schedules keep their shape. A damp, river mud smell means the Trave carries rumours, and rumours arrive before ships. You come early again, put the key with the reluctant bow into the bureau chest, and take out yesterday's packets to see if any of them already contradict themselves. The missing cog from Reval has not arrived. You do not write lost. You do not write late. You write what you can prove. The vessel did not touch at Travemünde on the expected tide. Pilots report a strange set under the DAS. Pilots talk in verbs, set, sheer, creep, that your ledger turns into nouns and times. You copy 2 lines onto your advice letters for the day, so that Bergen, London and Bruges will read the same silence you hear. That is one of the clerk's chief duties. Give different towns the same weather. The first interruption to the morning is ordinary. A brewer's factor arrives with a cooper and a quarrel folded into politeness. The barrels bound for London worked in the night. The staves eased and let the hoop slip down a finger. It happens when a warm hall meets a cold dawn. The cooper wants to blame the brewer's storehouse. The brewer wants to blame the cooper's slack hoop. You bring out the contour straight edge and the hoop gauge, both more patient than men. On the table, you set a sound barrel and the offender shoulder to shoulder. Roll the edge across and let iron and gravity teach humility. The cooper nods, not in defeat, but in relief. He reseats the hoop, drives a wedge, and asks you to note in the register that he corrected a fault before the key. You do. Corrected before key will save everyone a sentence later when London writes in their tidy way that 2 tubs arrived still singing. While the cooper's mallet is still speaking downstairs, the Rathaus runner brings a packet from the Hansa-Tag, minutes. From a meeting in which 6 towns spoke quickly, 2 spoke slowly, and 1 refused to speak until reminded that silence is a kind of speech. The toll at the sound has crept again. The king's men at Helsingør, salt on their boots and nice arithmetic in their heads, now expect a larger memory of his name from every hull that squeezes between Zealand and Scania. The League answers as it usually does, with arithmetic of its own. The minutes list the contributions each city will make toward convoys in the herring season and toward envoys in silk, who will explain, with all courtesy, that pressing a merchant too hard is the quickest way to press the king's own table into hunger. You copy the figures into Lübeck's book. You copy a smaller figure into your mind. The cost of 1 extra day at anchor, while papers are examined by men who enjoy examining. By mid-morning, the WAG, the Wayhouse, has adopted its solemn tone. A Baltic morning is a court without robes. 2 sacks of rye argue about damp with their odours. The master of the Wager lifts a standard stone with both hands and sets it gently, like a reliquary, on the pan. You stand by the window to watch the way the beam steadies. That steadiness is the city's spine. It allows people to argue without drawing knives. A Prussian carrier stares at the beam as if it were a moral lesson and mutters that the same sack in Elbing weighed sweeter. You do not refute him. You write a short note on his receipt. Pan true, sack cool to hand. Your notes are adjectives trained into evidence. There is mail from Bruges shaped like a change in a riverbed. The sea. Aldermen write that the Zwin, the channel that lets the city sip the sea, silts more than it used to. Their words are careful. Vessels of depth must watch the turn and go out to sea with men who know the swallow. They ask without asking that Lübeck advise skippers to favour tides and pilots, not only prayers. You copy this guidance beneath, the heading for Bruges with other practicals, where the barges wait, which quay forgives a heavy wheel, whose yard repairs a broken stern post without shouting. A trade league does not conquer mud. It learns its moods and writes them down. The Revel matter will not leave you. 2 tides late, then 3. You draft a letter to Rostock asking if their harbour watch sighted a square sail that moved like someone, discussing with the wind rather than obeying it. You send a boy to Travemünde with a small packet for the pilots. Any sign of a bale of flax with a Revel merchant's mark. The boy knows to return with words rather than stories. You have trained him to repeat sentences that begin with saw and counted. You also pull a piece of paper from the bottom of a drawer that you dislike touching. A bottom-re agreement on the Revel hull, the loan upon the ship and cargo, repayable only if the ship arrives. Bottom-re is a cold word for warm fear. You do not read the numbers aloud. You check that the terms match the seal and the sexagenary date and then put the paper back face down. Customers arrive with coastal weather in their hair. A Schonenfahrer wants salt counted out to the pallet for the Scania fare. His crew likes Lüneburg bricks because they crack predictably when tapped, and predictability is a kindness in October wind. A Bergenfahrer asks, not with worry, but with habit, whether the rye destined for his stockfish season can ride on 2 hulls instead of 1. Bergen is a place where redundancy tastes like prayer. You record both requests without comment and send a boy to the yard with a message, split thee sea. Rye. The boy returns with a grin that smells of tar and a sentence you will copy into the ledger as if it were a proverb. The skipper says 2 bellies are slower to starve. In the afternoon, a London letter arrives that is really a mirror. They write that your beer is good, your hoops behaved, and your tally matched the bill to a bung and a stave. But then they add a line about L measure at the steelyard. A parcel of cloth from inland was entered at an L that, when stretched in their hall, fell short by a hand's width across 40 bolts. You know how this happens. An L-rod swells in a damp shop and shrinks in a sunny hall. The clothier swears by his bench. The buyer swears by his wall. You take down the city L from the wall, the iron rod wrapped in oiled linen like a holy bone. You send for the clothier, and you lay rod and cloth side by side and invite him to look, not to listen. He does, and then he coughs. In that way a man coughs when he has been wrong longer than is comfortable. You do not write wrong, you write L-trude, rod resealed. You mark the rod with fresh wax and press the contours seal into it. The rod, like a treaty, must be renewed to remain itself. You could call this an age of paper if paper were common, but it is an age of memory made visible. You keep bundles of tally sticks paired and tied, Lübeck's half, merchant's half, fibres speaking truth by their jagged fit. You keep a tray of wax impressions you take at docking, so that if a cargo loses its manners mid-voyage, the hold's best story still matches the day the gangplank creaked. You keep a deep shelf of letters of advice folded by route, ribboned, by season, labelled in a consistent hand, so that when a skipper returns after winter, he can hold his year in his arms. None of this is glamorous. All of it is enough to make a century. The pilot lists need attention now that the sound toll grins. Pilots are some map and some music. You keep a roster, name, favoured reach, peculiar caution, last winter's luck. Jens, scar in fog, insists on an hour before he trusts his own eyes. Greta knows Bornholm sand like a seamstress knows hems, will not be hurried by a red sky. You write small beside some names. Temper sweetens with hot beer, not as gossip, but as instruction. A nervous skipper who hires the wrong pilot will make a winter story. A calm clerk who pairs the right 2 people lets grain become bread without becoming anecdote. Not every solution is on water. You meet in a short room with a low ceiling. Merchants, a wagon master, the beadle from the weighhouse, and you draw by hand a road across your table. If Bruges silts and winds set wrong at the score, you can relay part of a cargo by cart to Wismar or Rostock and catch a break in the sound when the king's men look elsewhere. Overland is dear. It is also the difference between a disappointed partner and a partner who merely sighs. You do not promise a route, you record a contingency. If Reeve will ship not in by third tide, move flax bales in thirds. Wismar, Rostock, hold. You write it in a dull hand so that, when you enact it, no one will call it panic. All afternoon you practice the quiet art of general average. A skipper from the east comes in with a face like a salt line on a hull and tells the story in 5 sentences. Wind turned, cargo shifted, a jettison was ordered. Bales went over to save timber and men. You take out the counterstones and lay them in 2 groups. What went over, what arrived. You apportion loss across all interests. Owner, cargo, lender, charterer. No one ever likes average, but everyone likes the way it makes an accident less personal. You write 4 receipts in the smallest neatness you can manage so that none of the men can pretend to misread. Then you hold up the bottom paper again, repayable if she arrives, and set it beside the stones. If Raval arrives, even late, a whole line of lives will feel their muscles soften. Evening leans into the window. Someone brings news from Shonan. The herring was strong at first, then ran thin, then surprised everyone by swelling again at a moon that did not deserve it. This is a merchant's version of a psalm. You add a note to the Scania book. Salt allotments flexed, barrels held. There is also a rumour that Dutch hulls have been offering to carry at a whisper under Lübeck's standard rates. You do not panic. You add watch freight offers to tomorrow's list, and know, because you have lived a while, that a league's answer is not to set its beard on fire but to insist, again, that measures, laws and payments agree. A cheap hull that miscounts arrives as a bargain and leaves as an insult. You go down to Travemünde at last light because that is what a clerk does when a ship is 2 turns late. You put your eyes on the mouth that eats and feeds the city. The pilots stand with their hands in their belts, reading the dark strip of horizon the way you read a line of figures. Not yet now. A small sloop comes in smelling of pitch and a story. The pilot says the sound was cranky and the darse was a hand taller than last week. He did not see a cog like yours. You feel the old temptation to assign fate a schedule, but you resist. You walk the quay until your boot remembers the weather through its sole. Then you go back to the city because paper must be written even. When wood is late, on your desk you leave instructions an apprentice can follow if tomorrow becomes difficult. If Revel makes Travemünde by first tide, split tally, flax to Lübeck Weighhouse, wax to the Guildhall, letter pouch straight to the bureau unopened. If no arrival, send the second letter to Rostock, awaken the convoy clerk, and lift the bottom paper for the alderman. If rumour of wreck, find the beadle who speaks kindly, and make a list of the names who will need to be told without being broken. These lines are not heroism. They are housekeeping for other people's fear. You think about the Kontora, far from this desk, the steel yard on the Thames where beer taps and cloth bolts argue in low voices, the Briggen in Bergen where stockfish dries straight as planks in a wind that does not admit hurry, the Peterhof in Novgorod where winter turns fur into coin and honey into patience. All those houses depend on this one not for bravery, but for consistency. When the Zwin silts, you do not curse the mud. You move the appointment and write everyone the new hour. When the sound toll grows teeth, you sharpen your pilot list and your convoy schedule and your compliments to kings. When a Cooper's hoop slips, you seat it, right before quay, and make a note to check the storehouse heat on mornings with a soft fog. This is how a league remains a league. A boy, your boy now, with a lamp-holding habit you have corrected 3 times today, asks, as if speaking to a shelf, whether the revel cog could have put into Danzig to ride out the set. You say yes, in a flat way that neither alarms nor reassures. You ask him to sharpen the knife that cuts paper, because nothing is quite so foolish as a jagged edge on a letter sent to a man who has been looking at a grey line of sea all week. He does as told, and then, without being asked, oils the rope that keeps the seal box from snagging. He is learning the etiquette that keeps a city from having to forgive what it should not have to forgive. The tower watch calls the hour. You close the chest and feel the weight of tallies and seals settle into wood, the way a deck settles into trust when a wind holds. In the lane, someone laughs at a joke with a punchline you have heard in 3 languages. On your table, 2 letters sit open, one advising Bruges to mind the swallow of the Zwin, one advising London that your L now agrees with theirs and will until the next damp day tries its luck. You snuff the lamp and let the dark do what it does best. Make tomorrow a blank page, heavy with yesterday's impressions. If water decides to move under your feet, and the king at the sound decides to count more slowly, can a desk full of habits, straight edges, pilot lists, before keynotes, fair averages, carry a city through the stretch between a late sail and a changed route, or will one piece you cannot see, the bottomry line, the sandbar that walked, the L that swelled again, be the one that reminds you how little ink can persuade wind? You wake with figures in your head and the taste of salt on your tongue. A clerk's dream is a ledger where every column closes. A clerk's morning is the understanding that columns close because people do the same small things the same way, especially when water changes its mind. You unlock the bureau chest and lift out the seal box, the tally bundles by route and season, the straight edge you trust more than eloquence. The first task is the same as yesterday's. Decide what can be written as fact. A letter gets there before the whole does. It comes on a small coaster that smells of pitch and impatience. A pouch from Danzig handed across the counter by a pilot with frost in his beard. You cut the red thread, soften the wax with your breath, and break it with your nail. The script is tight, the tone economical. A cog from Reval made the outer roadstead 2 nights ago, strained on a shifting groundswell, warped in under kedge, discharged part cargo to lighten, took on carpenters, and begs instructions regarding bottomry and general average. Flax damp on the outside bales, wax sound, letters intact. You read the 2 words you wanted, made and intact. The writing adds a sentence that is half courtesy, half account. Danzig's counsel recognizes Lubisches Recht in this matter. Salvage claims will be handled according to the same book you keep on your shelf. Law is not a romantic. It is a bridge. You roll across because the planks are in the same order in both towns. You do not ring bells. You lay out your day's apparatus like a physician preparing lint and thread. On the table go the bottomry bond, face up now, no longer a superstition, the tallies for the Reval cargo, the ledger for general average. You set out the counterstones in 2 neat piles, interest saved and interest sacrificed, and you sharpen your pen. You have practiced the tone for this kind of day. Small, exact, unhurried, incapable of drama even when someone wants to borrow some. The apprentice brings you a pilot's note from Travemünde. No sight last tide of the Reval. Sail, strong set after Darse. A gull line that suggests the shoals stirred. You mark the note in the margin. Superseded by Danzig, you send the boy back with a different errand. Down to the quay with word for the Bergenfahrer whose rye was split. One half will move on a Lübeck hull. The other can wait for the Reval ship's repaired passage or go overland to Wismar if impatience outweighs thrift. You write the sentence so that he can recite it without adding his own adjectives. The art of courier work is to carry neither fear nor reassurance in the voice. Next, you write to Danzig, not speeches, tasks. Hold the wax in a dry loft, air the flax bales under watch, and weigh the loss by bale. Hire carpenters for the sprung plank at our account. Take tally of all hands paid for the warping and the kedge. Note the names. Names matter. They convert rumour into wages owed. You enclose a letter of surety for the salvage men who pulled on ropes in the dark. Enough copper to pay them when tempers would otherwise be cheap. Lübeck keeps friends because Lübeck pays on time. The bottomry line is easy now that the word made sits on the page. You copy the premium due to the lender, money risked on wood and luck. payable only if wood and luck arrive. You set a stone on it to pin it to this day's arithmetic. Then you count average. The skipper's note says, 3 bales went over, the side when the load shifted. 2 more were sacrificed to gain height for the warping. The carpenter's invoice for fresh trenails has a damp edge that tells you it was written near a brazier. You apportion the loss across owner, cargo, lender. A recipe no one loves and everyone respects because it makes misfortune social. You write 4 receipts in a script small enough to leave no room for invention. A clerk's fairness is measured in a cramped hand. Word goes out into the city, the way heat goes out from a stove. The cooper you scolded yesterday hears that a ship danced on a groundswell and checks his hoops without being told. The weighhouse master sets his standards on the counter and rubs their rims with oiled cloth, as if gravity could be persuaded to continue its impartiality by courtesy. The wagoner who knows the road to Wismar counts axles in his head and asks whether it is rye or flax that must move. Because rye makes a dust that wants to be in a man's mouth all day, and flax rides, with a soft, heavy politeness when it is damp. The pilot list on your table draws your eye again, and you mark a dot next to a name. Jens took a hull off a shoal by waiting for the second tide rather than the first. Patience is a maritime skill with an arithmetic of its own. Before noon, the Hansatag's minutes are on your table with their slow thunder. Contributions confirmed for convoy in the herring season. Envoys named for Helsinger. Wording agreed for a letter that says, with perfect courtesy, that toll creep becomes hunger on royal tables as surely as on townsmen's. You copy Lubeck's share into the book. You will show the treasurer and add a line where you talk to yourself. Watch for Dutch freight whispers. Answer with standards, not with sulks. A league corroded by grievance becomes a set of neighbouring towns. Standards. Weights that agree, L's that match, seals that travel are the bronze that keeps corrosion out. The afternoon brings the Reval people. News travels faster than hulls when money is attached. The lender sits with his fingers steepled over the bottomry bond and does not smile until you show him the word made. Then he smiles exactly enough to admit that his risk was not wasted. The merchant who owned the flax bales that tasted water stands with the discipline of a man who has learned to keep his temper for winters, not for mishaps. You spread the stones, explain the share of general average, and let your finger move. Across the ledger, 1 line at a time. Your loss is shared because your cargo's sacrifice bought time and float for the others. The premium goes to the man who trusted wood. The porters in Danzig who shoved shoulder to rope will be paid from this line and recorded because men remember who counts them. No one thanks you. That is not what your desk is for. They sign or make their knife marks, and the day moves an inch closer to ordinary. You add small repairs to the machinery of trust. The L-Rod, resealed yesterday after London's letter, gets a companion note. Remind inland clothiers to hang their rods where air is steady, not against the stove. The Cooper's Register gets an asterisk by a name with today's phrase, corrected before quay. The pilot roster grows another line from a shipman's mouth, transferred carefully into writing. The DAS sets stronger this week. Count an extra hour on an ebb if your hull carries more than 8 last. This is how you teach people to be lucky. You put other people's luck into the book. At the Wager, a Prussian carrier returns with the same argument in a fresher sack. Elbing weighed sweeter. The master invites him to put his hand on the grain and asks him to name the temperature. He cannot, and he grins at his failure. You write on the receipt, pan true, grain cool, carrier courteous. Courtesy is a kind of collateral. It makes the second dispute easier than the first. Mid-afternoon, news from Bergen arrives in a hand you know by its impatience. They report that the stockfish racks hold well against the season's temper, that a previous delivery of rye from Lübeck baked honest bread, that 2 knives arrived brittle and were replaced without a quarrel, a sentence you have the habit of rereading 3 times because it sings your craft back to you, replaced without a quarrel. You file the letter beside the complaint bin and look at both. One keeps pride sensible, the other keeps shame useful. A city grows rich when it gives both boxes equal respect. You take a moment to read yesterday's advice to Bruges about the Zwin and write the echo for today. Danzig confirms respect for Lübeck law. Expect cargo remitted by thirds. Watch sound toll. Pilots' names enclosed. You enclose, with the letter to London, a thin impression of the resealed L, wax on a strip of parchment, so that a clerk there, cousin to you by trade and patience, can hold it to the light and see the same line you see. 2 rods in 2. Cities that match are better than alliance treaties. Late afternoon, a man from the Coopers Guild brings a quiet proposal because he has learned how the wind blows through the desk. With the sound toll rising and delays multiplying, ships are packing more tightly. He asks whether the contour will support a rule that beer-bound barrels be tested with a tap near the hoop. Listen for the tight ring, not only look for the seated iron, and that barrels for London pass a sound test in the Weighhouse yard on mornings when fog sits close. You write the draft of the rule in a neat, bored hand and insert the 2 words that make craftsmen tolerable to each other. Applies equally. A change that aims at one guild breeds stories. A change that touches everyone becomes habit. A runner from Travemünde comes panting with the good cowardice of a boy who fears to disappoint. He holds up a wet scrap of sailcloth with a reval mark, found in kelp near the mole. You look at the scrap, feel the felted weave under your fingers, and find the thread count you were trained to trust. You nod. True. Then you set the scrap on, the ledge, neither a trophy nor grief, and write to yourself, do not let a shred become a tale. We have Danzig's letter. A desk keeps rumour from picking up a second wind. You walk down to the harbour because seeing planks and ropes keeps paper honest. At the quay, the wind talks against the masts in a tongue you have learned to translate into schedule. A convoy clerk stands with a slate, counting hulls that have promised to run together during the Scania season, when herring draws both fishers and men with knives. You ask which pilots they have engaged and whether the envoys to Helsingør have a firm day. The clerk shows you a list with less ink than you like. You put a dot by tomorrow's time to remind yourself to nag politely. A city is a pile of polite nags aligned to the calendar. In the beer house, you hear commerce testing itself in jokes again. A skipper says the sound toll now computes by the size of the smile you wear. A wagoner says Wismar's road has learned a new pothole. A Bergenfahrer prescribes a remedy for swollen barrel hoops that would probably poison half of London. You file the jokes according to their uses. A jest about tolls is a warning. A jest about roads is a map. A jest about remedies is a plea for better rules. You drink slowly because ink dries faster if you give it time alone. When you return to the bureau, you find what you most wanted, Danzig's second letter, folded small, with a smear of resin on the outside. Sprung plank replaced, tar warmed, and set. Convoy of 2 small cogs ready to carry wax tomorrow. Flax has lost a hand's width on 3 bales, accounted. Carpenters and warpers paid. Names enclosed. You copy the names as if they were saints. People who push in the dark deserve to exist in ink. You send a boy to the guild hall with the wax count and a second boy to the weighhouse with instructions for flax weight allowances on arrival. You pay out 2 small gratuities under the line. One for the harbour watch who sent the letter by a quick hand, one for the scribe whose figures matched yours to the stroke. Even gratitude has a column when it keeps the machine oiled. You finish the average entries and close the slate on the bottom read with the shallow satisfaction of someone who respects premiums earned. The lender lifts his copy of the bond as if it were heavier than paper and says, not to you, but to the room. Arrived. He leaves before you can fold the thought into a compliment. There is still the sound to attend to, the problem that does, not mend with patches and wedges. You draft the envoy's talking points for Helsinger in the grammar your trade favours. Lists more than speeches, examples rather than indignation. When a hull waits 2 days at anchor while clerks practice arithmetic, 3 bakeries in Bergen learn new prices for bread. When beer misses a week, a London cooper learns contempt. You include the line that all tollmen understand. We will travel with more ships if we must. Convoy is a sentence powerful enough to make officers look out windows. You do one last small thing, because small things are the only lever you own. You take down the city's L again and put your own hand around it, where the cold keeps the iron honest. You press the contour seal into a thin wafer of wax and attach it to the rod with a ribbon, not for show, but to say aloud to yourself that your mouth and your hand and the rod agree. This is what keeps letters from turning into literature. At dusk, a sack arrives from the Guild of Schönenfahrer. 3 single bricks of Lüneburg salt, bound in reed, sent to the herring stalls as surety that the rest will follow. You escort the sack yourself to the wagon. You watch the way the driver sets the load. Bricks against the lip of the bed, rope on the diagonal, a twist only a man who has done it for years would know. You put a hand on the rope because you like the feel of a knot that will ride quiet for miles. He nods without looking at you, which is how craftsmen thank clerks. On your way back, you pass the Rathaus loft and ask the beadle about the hooks and the buckets. He smiles because you have asked again and says they oiled the hooks and replaced a split stave. A city does not burn tonight because a man earned his salary an hour ago. You write nothing. Habit keeps its own ledger. You close the bureau chest and listen to its hinge. It sounds right, low and sure, and you take superstitious comfort in that non-fact. In the lane, the watch calls the hour. In your pocket, the key sits like a small, domestic anchor. At home, you will lay it on the table and eat bread that tastes, if you are honest, like commerce. Flour from a field, whose measure agreed with someone else's measure. Salt from bricks you listed. Heat from wood, carried by a man who nodded at a scale that did not lie. If you reach for a lesson larger than today, you can find it without rhetoric. What saved money and tempers in this tale was not bravery or a new idea. It was compatibility, standards that made a Danzig carpenter's invoice legible in Lübeck, tallies that mated by tooth and grain after a hull danced the wrong way, an L that matched across a sea, a weight that rang the same song in 2 towns, a law that travelled on paper and lived in men's hands. That is the sort of boredom that lets a league outlast weather and princes. Modern people like to congratulate themselves with containers and barcodes and a web of bills of lading that move at the speed of electricity. You could be proud of the speed if you also remembered the pedigree. A tally stick's teeth are early barcodes. The L-rod is a shy ancestor of ISO 668. Lübisches Recht is a preamble to Incoterms. The Wager's stone is a grandfather of a calibrated scale under a customs camera. The convoy list is a draft of security filings. The clerk's, neat, corrected before key, is an early exception report. All that changes is velocity and vocabulary. The duty remains. Make sure platforms, wooden, legal, human, fit together so that rumours cannot lift prices faster than boats can carry grain. You lock the chest. Outside, someone hums a tune that came with a ship and stayed. The wind backs. A point and a hanging sign complains on its iron staple. You think of the envoys on the road to Helsingør with silk words and salt arithmetic, of the Danzig men who will walk home with resin in their nails, of the Bergen boy who will wake at dawn to check racks of fish that must not bend, of the London clerk who will hold your L impression to the light and smile without telling anyone, of the Revel skipper who will sit on a repaired plank and stare at tar as if it could answer questions. If world trade now runs in steel boxes and clicks, is anyone still tending the quiet pieces, the rods, the stones, the seals, the little sentences, like corrected before key, that prevent a late hull from becoming a story and a story from becoming a panic? Or have we made our systems so swift that we have forgotten how slow, boring compatibility taught our cities to eat? You wake in a low country where the horizon is a straight sentence and the wind edits it all day. The map is mostly water with a grammar of embankments, ring dikes around polders, summer dikes along rivers, winter dikes nearer the dunes, and the sleepers behind the wakers, Slapperdiken backing up the waker dike that faces the sea. If you come here thinking of waves and ships, you will learn first about lists. The Dutch phrase that matters is not heroism, but waterschap, the waterboard, and its book. The board's house is brick, the windows leaded, the door low enough to make pride bow. Inside, a long table holds quills, sand, a tin of sealing, wax, a brass weight shaped like a pear to hold down curling paper, and a ledger bound in calf with cords thick as your finger. The cover is worn where hands have pressed during worry. The men who assemble are not grand. A dikegraph sits at the head, reeve of dikes, part judge, part chairman, and to his left and right the heemraden, the wardens, farmers in good coats with mud at the hem. There is also a clerk with a tidy hand, a surveyor with a bundle of rods marked in Roden, rods, and Ellen, L's, and 2 bailiffs who will, in a month's time, go door to door with notices for those whose shovels were late. A map sits rolled on a stool. When unrolled, it shows nothing romantic. Parcels, drainage ditches, sluices drawn as rectangles, mills as small circles with a single vein. If you want to see courage in the Low Countries, look where the clerk touches the ledger. The book's first page for the year lists the cure, the bylaw, renewed and amended as needed, when to mow the dike, where to cut willows, how high to keep the crest against the pale, the standard water level, what counts as neglect, and what fine fits which neglect. You learn the verbs: scowen, to inspect; bekleden, to dress the slope with sod and fascines; spuien, to let water out through a sluice at low tide; bemalen, to lift water with a mill. Nothing in those verbs is dramatic. All of them accumulate into survival. The wardens schedule the scow, inspection, before spring grass hides winter damage. They read last year's column of breaches and soft spots, written in a matter-of-fact hand that keeps panic from finding a home. Near the Kodik, 47 Roden of outer slope slumped, 2 sinkholes at the toe where seepage, quell, was not relieved. 3 willow mats, Reiswerk, scoured at the bend by the ferry. The dikegraph taps the page with the feather end of his quill and says what he always says: "We will see." You go to the dike with them because paper here is always cross-checked with mud. The sea is on one side, inland on the other, a sheet of flat water studded with reed. The crest is narrow, tamped hard by carts and boots, grass clipped by sheep. A crest is a compromise. Too narrow and wagons abrade it. Too wide and money runs out. The wardens walk the outer slope in single file, heads bent, eyes on the beckleding, the skin, A good skin is a quilt of turf blocks laid like books and pegged with willow, the seams stoned lightly against gulls. Where the river meets the sea, you see zinkstukken, heavy willow mattresses sunk with stones to armour a toe against scouring. None of this is beautiful. It is famous for working. The surveyor carries a level mounted on a wooden staff and a notebook. He measures the crest's height against a fixed mark at the spuisluis, the drain sluice, where a gauge board reads the pale. In some districts, the peel is a local convention agreed by neighbours. Later, it will align to the Amsterdam's peel, and later still to a national datum. But for now, you live by marks cut into oak with a year carved below. The surveyor mutters numbers. The clerk writes. A warden pushes his heel into a soft place and shakes his head. If a winter storm has pulled turf from the outer slope near a curve, they mark it with willow switches and estimate how many manden, bundles, of fascines the slope will need to be dressed before autumn. When the Spuislui opens at low tide, you hear the country breathe. Inland water, bosom water, the gathered drainage, goes seaward in a brown rush through gates hinged to close when the tide pushes back. The gate timbers are iron-banded, heavy enough that 2 men lean their backs to a windlass to raise them. Nails and hinges take the sea's temper personally. The ledger lists iron purchases by weight and purpose. 4 dozen clenched nails for the lower strap, 2 new pintles, pitch for seams. The gate's sill is checked with a rod. If it sits proud of its seat, the sea will pry. The sluice keeper keeps a key in a leather pouch with a church's sobriety. Too many keys in this country provoke new water. Back along the dike, you see where the land has betrayed itself. The Dutch drained peat for fuel. Peat shrinks when you dry it. A field that sat easy against the dike when your grandfather was young now lies a hand lower, and the pressure of inland water on the dike's toe in winter is different, more subtle, more treacherous. The wardens know this without speeches. They order kwelgaten, seepage pits with drains to relieve pressure, and they mark on the map where the slapperdijk, the sleeper behind the main dike, should be raised a hand's breadth this year to forgive errors. You will not find a monument there. You will find a quiet line of earth that has saved villages more than once when the Wakadijk gave way. The waterboard's work is half earth and half arithmetic. Back in the hall, when boots are scraped and the map re-rolled, the clerk lifts the ledger by its 2 cords and reads out the verhoofdslag, the apportionment of cost by holding. A polder is not taxed by opinion. It is taxed by percellen, parcels, and larsen burdens entered beside owners' names. 1 man owes a day with a shovel for every morgen he holds. Another owes a cart of sod blocks. Another owes cash because his labour obligation was commuted years ago during a dry summer. If you think lists are dull, watch how they make neighbours equal. The board posts the names on a door, and the beadle nails small slips at the edges of farms. The slips do not shout, they explain. A man who does not show for his day at the dike incurs a fine listed down to the steward. 2 absences call the bailiff, 3 absences. The sale of a strip of land is entered under a column that does not bother to disguise its seriousness. You also see how a waterboard practices mercy without letting the ledger rot. A widow comes with mud on her shoes and a cap tied too tight, and says her sons are away on a barge for the rye harvest. The dijkgraaf listens. The heemraden avoid looking at one another in case kindness leaks into procedure. And the clerk, whose job is to keep both justice and water level, writes uitstel, postponement, for 2 weeks with a small mark that means the board will find a neighbour to take the shovel day and charge the widow a half rate later if the season allows. The ledger is not a whip. It is a memory you can negotiate with if you are honest and if rain threatens. There is a season for buitendijkse work outside the dike, where reed beds are cut for thatch and willow is harvested for fascines. Boys bundle the cut and stack it in cones, and the clerk notes how many shoven, sheaves, came from each common. He does not care about romance. He cares because fascines laid quickly after a storm save money in the next column. When a storm eats the bekleding, men tie bundles with their teeth and slam them into the slope with wooden stakes, a hammer rhythm you can feel in your knees. A good fascine holds silt in its arms. Left alone long enough, a fascine's brown becomes grass again. The ledger has a word for the moment when something that cost turns back into soil. Ingroi, grown in. Wind is not only a vandal, it is a servant. Polders do not drain themselves. You walk to a mollengang, a chain of mills that lift water in stages from low polder to higher bosom and out through the sluice. The old mills use shepraderen, scoop wheels with boards that throw water up into a trough. Later they will use visels, Archimedes screws turning in wooden troughs banded with iron. A miller keeps a peel glass, a glass tube or a staff calibrated, with chalk marks, and he watches the pond like a doctor watches a pulse. His ledger is a smaller cousin of the board's book, wind hours logged, repairs to sails, grease for the main bearing, sacks of rye received as pay from farmers who pay by share of use. On nights when the sea is high and the sluice stays shut, mills run to keep water below the floorboards. If the wind drops at the wrong hour, the miller lights his lamp and stares at the vane as if staring could push air. His prayer is a procedure. Open shutters, trim sail, check gear. Keep going until the sluice keeper's horn says spoy, let out. You could think the enemies here are simple. Storm tide, frost heave, the gnawing of waves. The ledger will teach you otherwise. There are also palwormen, shipworms, that eat wood underwater. In bad years they hollow piles that hold sluice frames until a hand goes through a beam that looks strong. There are burrowing creatures in the dike, rats later, other animals earlier, that make piping, secret tunnels where water finds a path. The clerk lists vangers, trappers, by name and rate, because biology turns into budgeting when water follows teeth. There is also the creep of salt into soil during dry summers, which the board answers within Leighton, allowing a measured inflow of fresher water to flush fields through culverts, then lifting the mixture out again with mills, a choreography, written in timetables and sluice boards. A water board speaks to outsiders through charters. In the chest by the clerk's table are dikebrieven, the dike charters, folded like maps, with seals that are heavy for their size. A charter is a bundle of obligations made visible. Which village maintains which reach, where a banner, district ends, how to split the cost of a kierslu, a tide gate, between two parishes that both need it. When a merchant town upriver wants to cut a new canal to float more grain to a market, the board answers with questions that look like discourtesy, but are only engineering written as law. Where will the spoil go? How will your channel cut our peat? What peel will you keep? What sum will you post against future repair? You might think trade is impatient here. It lives by permission. You begin to see how much of this country's fate is outsourced to calendar. The board's book is a rhythm. Spring scow, summer beckleading, autumn willow cutting and sluice repair, winter budgeting and court. There are court days because water makes law busy. A man who plants poplars too near a dike's foot must cut them or pay. Roots find toes and pry. A woman who leaves a gate unlatched and lets cattle tread the crown owes a fine and a day with a spade. The fines are not vengeful. They are a price placed on temptations. The clerk writes geboet, fined, next to names, and, if the dikegraph is in a good mood, writes in the margin the excuse a man offered, because excuses season a ledger like salt the sea, and some deserve remembrance. The cow got the better of me. The wind thought my hat was a bird. I slept like Pete on the day the scow rides the dike. You walk behind the Wardens and the beadle, who carries a pole with a hook for pulling mats and a small axe for cutting willow pegs. There is a ritual to scolding. The beadle stops at a soft place, raises the pole, and recites the parcel and owner and obligation. The owner, if present, nods or blushes or both. The clerk writes one of two words: Gudgakerd, approved, or Afgakerd, rejected. The rejected stretches go into a tally that will become Labour Days, and, if those do not appear, fines. When the scow ends at a tavern with a low ceiling and good beer, the ledger closes on a wedge of wood to keep air in its binding, and the Wardens drink exactly enough to salt tomorrow with stories, but not so much as to let those stories spill over the dike top. You keep hearing a proverb you resist turning into a motto, that God made the world, but people here made the Netherlands. The book in the clerk's hands argues for a quieter truth. People here maintain the Netherlands. Creation is a story. Maintenance is a schedule. The schedule includes decisions that look boring until you see their consequence. Should the board raise the peel a finger this year to spare drying peat, at the risk of more seepage under the dike in winter? Should a new ringvart, a ring canal, be cut to carry bosom water more quickly to a larger sea sluice, even if it means 2 years? Of assessments harder than a bad harvest, should a sleeping dike be raised now, when money is thin, or left flat in the hope that storms will be polite for one more season? You learn that caution has a cost, and so does hope. There are days when the sea writes itself into the ledger in a darker ink. The clerk will add a page called Storm Shade, Storm Damage, and the Warden's list will fill with numbers that carry the weight of nights no one slept. So many Roden lost near the ferry, so many carts of clay needed at the break by the dike. House. So many fascines sunk with stones at the toe where the channel bent too near. But in the ordinary year, the book remains tidy, and you discover that a tidy book is a kind of levy against bad imagination. Panic cannot gain purchase where the next step is written, because there are many boards. Hoog Heemraadskappen on the bigger waters, smaller waterskappen on the local. Compatibility matters. The clerk keeps a separate, thinner book titled Overleg, Consultation, Listing, what the neighbouring board promised and when. If a river board upstream lets water out too quickly, a seaboard downstream curses politely and writes a letter that begins like this: Gentlemen, your sluices spoke too loudly on the night of the north wind. We ask that you count to 30 between boards. The answer will take the form of a schedule, not an apology. A country this flat remains alive by aligning clocks owned by different parishes. You notice, at day's end, which objects carry the system's soul. The pailstock, the staff marked in fingers and thumbs, and later in centimeters, leans against the boardroom wall like a mute magistrate. The Keurbok, with its ragged ribbon markers, lies open to the page about livestock on crowns and children, sliding on ice near sluice gates. The iron L, the measuring rod, sleeps in a case, ready to arbitrate between men who swear by different elbows. In a box at the back, sealed packets hold older Dike whose language is more Gothic, and the clerk reads from them when a new Heimrad gets ideas and needs to be reminded that water laughs at novelty. These objects do not look like courage, and yet they are the shape courage takes when wind arrives. If you walk the crest in late light, you see how the country's skin keeps being replaced. A team strips sod from a pasture, stacks it in a cart, and hands it in squares to men kneeling on the outer slope. The squares go down like books on a shelf, pegs through seams, the hammer thud finding a rhythm that matches the tide. A child nearby counts the blows. It is not a lesson. It is a habit being taught in numbers. You cannot teach a storm not to arrive. You can teach a village to lay 1-200 sods before dusk, without argument. You may be tempted to look for single days that made all this necessary, the names of floods that citizens whisper like saints in their feast days. Those days exist and will have their sections later. But the reason the Low Countries exist at all is because of hundreds of mornings like this one, when men and women measured, levied, pegged, cut, spaded, wound gates, and lifted water on wood and wind until the tide told them they could sleep. If you need a drama, you may have it. It is the drama of keeping edges. If the ledger is the country's second coast, numbers as a line against forgetting, what happens when the book itself meets a season it cannot balance? When peat keeps sinking, timber prices jump, and winter tides press 3 hands higher than the peel expects. Does routine bend without breaking, or does the sea finally find where memory left a gap? You learn to hear danger in a wind that will not finish its sentence. It begins as a low, northeasterly murmur at breakfast. No drama, just a tone that makes spoons clink differently against bowls. In the waterboard house, the clerk has already turned a ribbon to the page labelled Najar Stormen, Autumn Storms, and set a pear-shaped weight on the ledger so it will not shut itself at the first shiver of a door. The digraph looks at the barometer only because the apothecary left it. As a gift, he trusts the pond behind his house more. It has a way of warning him. Wind squalls writing in small italics on the surface. Reeds lying flatter and longer after each gust. You go to the crest before the first squalls complete their thought. The Wakerdike, the waking dike, wears its summer green like a boast. The Binnenterlude, the inner slope, shows sheep-cropped grass, neat as a barber's work, and the Buitenterlude, the seaside, shows the quilt of sods laid in spring, each square pegged and the seams stoned. Far below, the Tien, the dike's toe, rests on a shelf armoured with zinkstucken, willow mattresses sunk with stone. The surveyor brings his pailstock, the graduated staff, fingers and thumbs on the older marks, neat numbers scratched later. He reads the peel against the Spuisluis gauge and nods. Ordinary high water yesterday. Today already sits a thumb above. He does not sigh. He writes the number, and the clerk later will copy it to a narrow column you might miss if you did not know where danger starts. Work before weather is a procedure, not a wish. The shot balcon, stop logs, are lifted from their lean-to and laid near the sluice grooves. Their faces are planed and waxed, their edges checked for splinters that would bleed a tie back into the country. A pair of men in wool caps check the cadamore, the low-key wall, at the sluice mouth for missing bolts. Farther along the dike, Reiswerk, fascine work, sleeps under a tarp. Boys bring out cords and stakes and lay them like a quiet threat against the hour when they will be slammed into wet clay with hammers that speak no adjectives. At the Mollengang, the millers grease the main bearings, check the Wiesel, the screw, by hand for wobble, and pin spare shutters for the sails against the mill wall, prayer written as inventory. The sluice keeper puts the heavy key in his pouch and pats it as if it were a sleeping child. Keys in this country are promises. At midday, the board convenes a scow outside the scheduled calendar. The beadle reads parcels and obligations into the wind the way a priest reads a psalm to a deaf parishioner. Out of duty, not hope. The clerk marks the outer slope where sods show Scheifsporen, thin slips where earlier rain loosened the skin, and the wardens assign Bakelieden, dressings of fresh turf, to to cruise by parcel. One warden whose farm abuts a low reach notorious for quell, seepage, has come with a spade polished by years. He pushes its tip into a damp patch at the foot and watches water bead along the blade. Piping will start here, he says, and nobody contradicts him. The surveyor notes, Quellsloten, seepage ditches, to be cut tonight behind the toe, and Quellgarten, relief pits, to be lined with brush so small fountains can exhaust themselves harmlessly. Money now becomes earth at speed. The digraph flips the ledger to the omslag, the cost roll, and reads the emergency clause you had skimmed when the weather was polite. When the sea stands above the peel for more than one tide and the wind holds levy an extra day labour on each morgen of land, households providing a man under 16 or over 60 may pay in coin. You watch a calculation run around the table like a wave hitting pilings. How many hands? How many carts? How many Kreiwagons, wheelbarrows? How many Mandan, bundles of fascins to pull from the winteree that slept thinking it would be needed later? Nothing here is dramatic except the arithmetic. By late afternoon, the Wackadike speaks in a different register. On the outer slope, the sod quilt darkens and gleams where spray runs back. The creek mouths near the sluice show a rip that runs counter to common sense as the Bozem, the gathered inland water, presses outward and the sea presses in. The sluice keeper cranks the windlass and drops the gates. The timbers clap their iron and settle into their stone sills with the polite denial of old friends. You stand in the gatehouse and feel the floor hum. The clerk writes, Spui gestoppt, spilling stopped, beside the hour. It is a sentence that teaches you to sleep with one ear. Night arrives like an accountant. The Dikewacht, Dike Watch, walks, with lanterns along the crown, tapping with spade handles at intervals to feel for hollowness. At the foot, a man kneels by a newly dug quellgat and watches the little column of sand in the pit dance the way a glass dances on a fiddle. Up, down, up. When the sand stays still, he smiles at nothing and moves to the next pit. On the inside slope, a girl not yet 15 drags a heap of sackcloth. Her task is to hand sacks where men shout without turning. The ledger will make no line for her. The board's book measures labour by morgen and stiver, not by children with numb hands at midnight, but the country rests on both. The first brook, break, does not announce itself with a roar. It announces itself with a slumping line on the outer slope where Bekleding lost its grip at a bend. A watcher shouts. The sound is half vowel, half weather. Men run with fascines. 2 ramstakes, 2 tie, 2 laybrush against the slope, and one man with cheeks like apples rams a stake in by the steady violence you learn to admire in the spring. Hollen, slayen, binden, hollow, strike, bind. The fascine holds, then sags, then holds. A boy drops a stake and swears and picks it up again. A warden writes nothing. His pencil would get wet. By dawn, the mills have run for hours, climbing the pond by inches while the sea sat with its hands on the outside gate and smiled. The millers keep Winderen, wind hours, by mark on a board. Act for the night, dry for the morning thus far. They will enter them in their small ledgers with grease-stained thumbs later, when their wives bring soup and the first warm beer of the day. The sheprad, scoop wheel, in the oldest mill slaps water with the regularity of a heart. The Vidsel in the new mill mutters like a deep man. You could build religion out of these sounds if you wanted to, but the waterboard brought a schedule instead. A messenger from upriver arrives with a sentence that complicates everything. The riverboard opened early. Their sluices spoke in the night to spare their own banks, and the bosom levels in your map have risen a hand's breadth. The overleg, consultation book on the clerk's table has a page for such moments. He writes the hour and the river, board's name, and a mild line. Verzocht tell pauses, requested counting pause, between boards. It will be a letter later, polite and hard, a schedule with grace notes. 30 heartbeats between boards on a north wind, 1 minute on a falling glass. Compatibility here is a kind of piety. The wind keeps its vow. Toward noon, you see welliches, little boils, on the inner toe where piping prefers to whisper before it speaks. A man kneels and cups one with his palm and feels sand on his skin. Zand mi voor, sand carriage, is the word in the ledger. It smells like silt and ends in lake. The wardens order kistdammen, small box dams, built of planks and sod to trap the boils. They lay zandzakken, sandbags, above and press with kneeling weight, so the hydraulic path becomes the kind of wet that stays, rather than the kind that rips. A child is sent to count the bags, so the ledger can be trued later. He miscounts twice, and then gets it right with his tongue between his teeth. The beadle makes a small tick by the number. He will remember the child when he grows a shoulder for a spade. In the sluice house, the key behaves like a conscience. The keeper admits a chute, a locking, at the small canal for boats that bring fascines and take away fear. He slides shotbalken into grooves above the lower gate to make a pocket of water that ignores the sea's opinion for a moment. As the boat passes, he lifts a board and lowers it again, counting to 5 between breaths. The boat scraps the sill with a noise that gets into your teeth. The ledger has a column for repairs to sills, and a word for timber that has had enough. Vermoeid, tired. Things tire here. Men, timbers, hemp cords, rules. By afternoon, the palworm, shipworm, shows up as a rumour and gets written as a cost. A sluice frame beam that looked strong yields to a hand and shows a honeycomb at its heart. The clerk writes Nordse Steen, Nordic stone, into the purchase line for next spring. Timber in this reach must be skinned with hard stone where salt stands often. The digraph scowls for a heartbeat. Stone costs, and then nods. The omslag moves by such nods. You will pay in stivers now or in Velan later. The great scour pools that mark a future breach like a dark eye. The board prefers coins. The poorhouse sends women with kettles and bread. The ledger will repay the poorhouse. With a line, brewed on beer for Dikelegger, bread and beer for the Dike army. It is an army because the board calls it so when they read names in a row and men and boys answer here, here, here. No drums beat, but the hammer rhythm on the outer slope and the scoops of the wheel are percussion enough. You start to understand why the board writes Gojakurd and Afgakurd, approved and rejected, without adjectives. Adjectives make enemies. Adjectives loosen sod. Toward evening, the wind backs a point. The sea's face changes slightly. The wash has less jaw. The sluice keeper tests the gate with a lever. It shivers in place instead of shoving back. He waits as the dikegraph taught him. Not for the first permission, but for the second. Not for the first easing, but for the one that repeats. Then he opens a span no wider than a coffin lid and listens to the country exhale into the tide. The ledger gets a line. Eerste spoy, first spilling, at the hour. You do not cheer. You watch the inner toe for boils, the outer slope for slips, and the mill pond for the small fall that says the Molengang may drop a gear and breathe. You discover what compatibility feels like in muscles. Men from a neighbouring Hoogheemraadschap arrive unbidden with Stortstein, loose stone, and a pont with a flat nose that can kiss a flooded bank without breaking. They bring their own beadle and not their own rules, because rules travel poorly in weather. They ask the local wardens where to pour and how to count and fall in with the existing cure as if it is their own. A few seasons ago, the boards argued about a drainage cut. Today their stones do not ask about old quarrels. You make a note in the overleg book with a satisfaction that reaches your shoulders. Stone loaned, accounted next winter. Debts kept across. Districts are ballast. Night comes a second time, and with it that part of fear that is arithmetic. Spring TJ, spring tide, under a north wind. The beadle hangs a lamp on a nail near the sluice and draws a line on the wall with charcoal at the old high water mark. The Hugwaterstein you see in cities, written into learned stone, has its simple cousins in soot in places like this. A warden touches the line with a finger for luck. You think of names, the Allerheiligenvloed, the St. Elizabethsvloed. The Flood Saints people whisper with year numbers stitched into them like thread. This night, you do not want a new name. Names in this country are wages or wounds. Past midnight, the Wakkerdijk shows its teeth. A short reach near a ferry bend that the surveyor had marked with switches in spring, slapper clay, soft clay, gives a shiver down its face. The fascine crew runs, but the slope slides in a sheet, clay shearing along a wet plain that had been assembling itself out of tiny disloyalties all year. The breach is small, Ian Royde, a rod, but it is a mouth that likes speaking. The warden, in charge, does not sing epics. He shouts 3 verbs, clay, rise, rennen, clay, brush, run. Carts begin to shuttle from a queel. A borrow pit cut behind the inner toe, up and over and down. Men with crywagons make an ant line. Sacks go down dry, come back wet, and go down again. A woman with a firmer voice than any man's assigns. The sacks. 2 to the right, 1 to the left, 1 to the centre. You will not find her in the ledger either. The ledger's economy is too simple for the country's salvation. Dawn, thin as skim milk, writes pale along the eastern reed. The breach has been gagged, not healed. The Mollengang shows it in their shoulders. Men slouched against a tail beam. Another tightening of Vang. The brake, only slowly, so the sail will not shiver itself loose in a gust. The sluice has been lifted aboard deeper. The relief is audible, a low, surprised throatiness after a night of denial. The clerk writes a column-headed storm shade, storm damage, and begins to turn mud and fear back into numbers. Buitentalud verplaatst, 11 ruden. Schade aan schotbalken, 3 stuks. Zinkstuk aangevuld, 24 manden. Arbeidsdagen extra, 86. Brood en bier, 6 vaten. He leaves a space for doden, dead, because the ledger is honest. He fills it with nil, and you see his hand steady itself on the page, as if it had almost written the wrong number. The second day is smaller. Winds tire too. The sea returns part of what it took. The tide sits less high for reasons you could dress as moon and pressure and fetch, but which you experience as relief at the place where your jaw meets your neck. The Dijkwacht still walks. The Kwelsloten still drink. The Bozem still paces the line between patience and panic, but the edges stop sharpening. In the afternoon, the board meets with boots still damp and reads the overleg letters. Thanks to the upriver board for counting slowly between boards. Thanks to the neighbours for stone, a request to the town council for Noorderstein for the sluice frame. A notice to owners along the ferry bend that next summer's assessment will be strong in their reach. The beadle notes 3 late men and writes Gebod, fined, beside their names. He also notes the widow who sent her youngest with sackcloth and writes Utstel with a small cross that you have learned means kindness. After the storm, you walk the dike with a different eye. You see where the Bekleding shows seams like healed scars. You see where Ingroe has already begun to turn the fascine brown back to green. You see where a wheel, a dark pool, sits behind an older reach, proof of a breach that once cut through and left a crater the dike later walked around. Wheels a memory filled with water. Men fish in them. Children throw stones into them. The waterboard draws a neat oval on the map and labels it with a year and the word Doorbrack, breakthrough, as if by naming you could keep the old mischief from repeating itself in a new place. The mills slow to a moral pace. The Weitzel makes fewer mutters. The sheprad lifts less as the pond drops toward what the miller calls comfortable. The mark on his pale glass he likes to see when wind rests. The sluice keeper opens on tides with the prudence of a man who has been frightened into patience. The dikegraph sits with the clerk and the cost roll and makes the marks that transform gratitude into coin. Gratuity to neighbour board, repayment to poorhouse, 2 timbers in hard stone next spring, grass seed by the last week of April. In the court column, the clerk copies 3 geboten for men who did not come when the lamp bells rang. He copies 1 quite-shelding, remission, for a man who came belatedly with a mule and worked 2 days without asking where his name sat on a page. None of this is courage. All of it is the architecture by which courage can show itself again. Without talking about itself too much, you can call this a reprieve. The board will call it a freakening, settling. They will run their fingers down the winter's omslag, weigh how to buy stone and timber without squeezing a harvest that has already been frightened. They will write the word paleverhoging, raise, the level, in the margin and circle it, because peat sinks more each year, and the inland weight against the toe will not forgive ignorance in January. They will plan a ringvart, a ring canal, on the map's clean flank to move bosom water faster to a bigger sluice, knowing that planning is a way of saving the part of a village that is not yet built. You will copy the plan and not believe in it until you hear the first spade bite. What remains in your ear after the storm is not the highest noise. It is the low work, the rake of brush across clay, the slap of a scoop wheel, the little hiss when sand boils stop moving, the clack of schotbalken tongues against grooves. The ledger closes on its ribbon weight and holds the season like a shoreline, storm shade on one side, ingree on the other, and you understand why the first page of every year is the cur. Rules written before weather let people behave as if they like one another when the water rises, which is to say, quickly, without bargaining for their dignity. If this was only wind and clay, you could end here, but there is a darker arithmetic that the board cannot ignore. Peat keeps sinking, timber grows dear where oceans gnaw, and rivers open and close in the night according to bargains made a valley away. If a winter of bad moons arrives, 3 hands above the peel, and a riverboard that cannot afford to wait, can the Slapperdike hold what the Wakerdike yields? Or will this country learn a new name to add to the flood saints and write a fresh oval on the map where a village used to be? You do not meet the climax as a wave with teeth. You meet it as a ledger that refuses to close. After the storm, you survived. The board balances storm shade against omslag, damage against levy, and finds that the sum sits stiffly like wet wool. Peat keeps sinking. Timber, dear last year, is dearer now. The riverboard upstream has learned the virtue of counting between boards, but their warehouses are as thin as yours, and thrift makes men brave in the wrong places. All winter, the peel has read a finger higher than memory prefers. The clerk bends over the book and copies the cure for spring, adding small words that taste like risk, peelverhoging, raise the level, an extra slapperdike, a new sleeper. This is how a crisis becomes administrative before it becomes wet. The board sends the beadle along the crest with a packet of posted notices, and you walk with him because posts are the country's first coast. The slips say what they always say: scow in 3 weeks, Becleiden by parcels before hay cutting, fines by the stuver, and something they do not always say, nudecade, an emergency inner embankment, to be raised along the backfields of the ferry bend. Men read the word with the boredom it deserves, and then look at the sky as if to ask whether boredom will be enough this year. Spring arrives in that impatient way northern light prefers. The wind is less north and more east. The Mollengang hums like a miller's prayer, short and steady. You watch men cut sod from a pasture that has fed cows for 50 years and lay it like books on the emergency line. The sod smells of last season's dung and this season's sun. A boy counts pegs and miscounts and learns again. The clerk records nudecade, 312 Roden, Becklead. You write the number not because it is heroic, but because it is a future argument you will not have to endure when someone asks whether a sleeper was really awake before it was needed. 2 months pass the way they always pass, spoyen at low tide, bemalen when the wind condescends, scowen before grass hides mischief. Then the names people whisper as saints collect in the air like metal filings toward a magnet. Late autumn brings a low pressure that reads like a warning on the pond. Early winter adds a full moon. A wind begins to soar at the northeast in a way the board's oldest member dislikes. You sit in the hall while the Dike graph reads the cure aloud, not because anybody needs reminding, but because procedure is a charm in a country that will not let charms work by themselves. The first day of the flood season is a memory rehearsal. The shop balcony oiled, the sluice sills scraped, the Reiswerk stacked, the mills greased. The second day is unusual. The river board sends word of a broken ice run. They ask your board to hold spoi longer than courtesy would dictate, while they bleed off their reach before the flows snarl behind their gates. The clerk looks at the overleg page, weighs the sentence against your own pond's patience, and writes to Jaweezen, granted, with a small dot that means the board will remember the favour. Friendship among waterboards is made of such dots. By nightfall, the sea has laid its hand on the gate and declines to remove it. The wind does what wind does when it thinks it knows you, finds the one sentence that makes you small and repeats it. The Wakerdijk holds its green under a salt polish. You tramp the crown with the Dijkwacht and feel the earth give a courteous fraction under your heel at familiar places and a ruder fraction at the ferry bend. The man with the polished spade pushes his blade into the inner toe and watches the sand dance in the pit. Zand me voor, he says, and nobody likes the rhythm of the word in his mouth. The breach opens at dawn in the least dramatic way, an outer slope quilt that slumps along a seam and does not stop slumping. At the toe, the zinkstukken take the first insult and answer with a patience they have earned by sleeping under water all year. But patience is not a wall. The slope moves as a sheet. Clay shears along a glijvlak, a slipping plane. You have been mapping in your bones since harvest. Men run with fascines. The hammers sing hollen, slaan, binden, and you can feel each syllable in your knees. It is not enough. You hear the word that ends one problem and begins another. Doorsteken, to cut. The board has used it in stories about other winters. Now the Dijkgraaf says it without calling it cowardice or heroism. He points not at the breach, where men still throw sacks and swear, but at the nudecade inside the bend and the Slapperdijk beyond. Between them lies a lane and a church, and a line of apple trees still holding the last brown fists of fruit. The plan is simple. Open the Wakerdijk where you decide, not where water chooses. Flood the polder to the Nuudpeel, the emergency level, and let the sleeper carry the part of the country you can actually keep. The right is older than anyone. Book. You fetch tools that prefer peacetime, spades, mattocks, a saw for the turf pegs, and use them to do what feels like a betrayal. The beadle reads the parcels affected, and the clerk lays the tally sticks and the Dike brief charter on the table in the sluice house to remind everyone that procedure still runs even when Earth does not. Farmers lead cows up the crown, rope over horns and hands on hips. A woman passes with a bundle of linens on her head and turns back once to look at the low door of her house as if the door itself needed comfort. You cut in silence because talking in the face of a controlled sin is impolite. The turf comes up in neat squares. Clay resists and then yields. Willow roots pull and then pop. When the hole is the size of a coffin lid, the polder stares through at the sea and blinks. When it is the size of a wagon bed, the polder swallows once and begins to drink. The water runs brown and then green and then brown again as the upper clay layers dissolve. A wheel begins to scoop itself behind the new opening. A dark bowl with the slow threat of depth. The Noodcade accepts a wet hand and holds. The Slapperdijk stands behind it with the stubborn pride of an older sibling. The men at the original breach notice that their sacks suddenly weigh less against the slope. The water has been given a more polite argument and takes it. The ledger will make this into 5 lines. Nooddoorsteking, 1, wiel gevormd, 1, polder op noodpeil, Slapperdijk gehouden, evacuatie langs Kruin, 3 uur. Figures hide the hours and the hollows under ice. But the books, restraint is the country's spine. When the water board meets this winter, they will not argue about whether somebody saved the village or surrendered a field. They will read the 5 lines and enter the cost to the parcels and write kwijtschelding for those who lost walls while keeping the right to complain next year about someone else's uncut willows. The flood sits 3 days. The mills turn without pride. The Wiesel turns with a tired sound like a man counting in his sleep. The sluice keeper opens a board when the sea's face allows and closes it when the sea's face complains, and the hours acquire a sameness that makes room for a kind of civility. Bread runs, beer at the gatehouse, a boy sleeping on a sack of sand because nobody had a hand to carry him home. When the wind backs and the sea's jaw unlocks, the country exhales under your boots in a way. Your knees will remember when the weather is innocent again. Then the long work begins. You take clay where a bank can spare it and lay it where a bank cannot. You dress the outer slope with fresh beckledding. You drive new willow pegs until your shoulders write their own ledger in your sleep. The wheel remains. You cannot fill it with sense or soil. The dike will walk around it with a tack that looks like a kink on a map and feels like a concession to a past argument you lost. You set posts at the new curve and carve a date into one and resist the temptation to give it a saint's name. The board convenes a freakening, settling accounts under a safer sky. The omslag for this year is larger than any you have seen. The clerk reads it in a flat voice and then reads the kwijtscheldingen in a different flat voice, one that lets you hear breathing in the room. The cure is amended yet again. Verbod op, turfgraven binnen zoveel roede van teen, no peat cutting within so many rods of the toe, verbod op bomen op kruin en buitentalud, no trees on crown or outer slope, new pile, a new level, drawn a finger higher on the staff and entered in ink. You learn, as you always do, that caution has a cost you can pay in stivers or in names carved on beams. The board prefers stivers. Your reach of country does not invent anything the rest of the Low Countries have not already learned and will learn again. Elsewhere, boards write ovals on maps and years beside ovals. Some winters come with proper names that live for centuries in mouths and children's games. All Saints, St. Elizabeth, and people point at wheels with flat stones around them and say, "Here, the repertoire grows." Sleeper dikes set back from wake dikes like second eyelids. Ringvaten, ring canals that quicken the pace of bosom water. Keersluizen, tide gates, armoured in Nordsesten, mills replaced by steam Gemalen, where wind runs out more often than money does, and then electricity where coal and steam run out of courtesy. At some point, later than your ledger, earlier than your grandchildren, a man in a city puts a pin in a datum and says that all peels will be reference to a single thought. The Amsterdam's pale becomes the wayboards far from your reed beds agree on what a finger means. At another point, a country that has learned too many names for flood invents a civil service to hoover the scattered competence of boards into a national habit. Riksvaterstaat. The clerk's book becomes a filing cabinet, becomes a computer that can tell a minister what your polished spade already knew before dawn, that sand dancing in a pit is a problem that will not negotiate. Centuries step. The North Sea learns a new arrogance in a year, with a frost that locks rivers and a moon that pleases itself. A flood climbs over a generation's pride, and people who never saw wheels except in old stories suddenly have one in their yard. Your ledger would have written stormshade. Theirs writes evacuati and dijkdoorbraak, and then a new word, deltawerken. That is not a book but a program of gates, walls and openings as carefully argued as any cure. You do not live to see Afsluitdijk turn sea to lake, or sluices that sleep until a computer says spwy in the grammar of a national pond. But the verbs do not change. Schouwen, bekleden, spuien, bemalen. Only the volumes do. If you walk the dike now, whatever now means in a country with more than one kind of memory, you will still meet the old furniture under new varnish. A pale stock survives as a museum stick because a sensor hangs where the stick once leaned. A curebook becomes a PDF that a beadle carries on a tablet as he bikes the crown and marks a soft place with a pin in a map that other men can read immediately without waiting for a clerk to sand his ink dry. The omslag is a tax that arrives as a letter with a barcode, but still lists Morgan and Purslane in the stubborn ancestry of its columns. The water board collects for eel ladders and wastewater treatment now, but you can feel the old verbs humming under the new nouns. Elsewhere, the country has learned to add a verb you did not grow up with. Ruimte geven, give room. Where rivers ran between meanness and embankments, planners draw back a line and let a winter pulse of water spread into a place agreed for it, with a name agreed for it, at an hour printed on a schedule. It looks like surrender. The ledger makes it maintenance. A controlled flood is a nudecade drawn before a winter, not during one. Your board's chest still holds dijkbrieven folded like maps. The beadle keeps the key, and a child who once counted sandbags now edits overleg minutes between neighbouring boards about a new sluice that will talk to a tide gate miles away, as if distance were finally bored into obedience. Yet the country's survival still depends on boring courage you can neither automate nor praise properly. Someone still walks the crown after 3 nights of bad wind and presses a heel into a place that has no business being soft and says, afgekeurd. Someone still remembers to oil the iron that keeps the gate from shrieking at midnight, because an unnecessary shriek is an invitation for panic to write a paragraph on a page meant for numbers. You end, as you began, with a book that must make tomorrow possible. The clerk runs a finger down a column and pauses at the line that pays a widow for the cow she forced across the crown between 2 boys with rope around their waists. He writes Kwijtschelding for her parcel this year and straightens the line that will ask her to send those same boys to help dress the Buitentelude in spring. Fairness here is not sentiment. It is a way to keep hands present when water chooses its hours. Stand again on the crest. The wheel off to your left carries an old oval of reed and the appetite of depth. The Wakerdijk wears its new sod with a faint seam. The Slapperdijk looks like a stern aunt who has forgotten how to smile and never needed to. The sea shifts its jaw. The Spijsluis breathes in phrases. Behind you, the mills, or their steel children, keep lifting. You could make a story about heroism out of that night of cutting, but you would be telling a loud story about a quiet skill. The country did not survive because someone shouted. It survived because thousands of someones took turns reading a page, carrying sacks, pegging sod, counting between boards, writing Godjekurd in dry weather, so that in wet weather nobody needed to argue where the hammer should land first. If seas climb by the thickness of a coin each year and storms lengthen their sentences, will we remember to keep the habits that let the Slapperdijk wake on time? Shared peels, schedules with neighbours, ledgers that pay widows without breaking rules. Or will we wait for a new saint's name before we write the simple line that saves the most ordinary morning? Standards matched, bond repaid, losses averaged, not heroic, just compatible. That's how a league outlasts princes and weather. If this gave you a new lens on how old trade actually worked, tap like, share to one friend who loves serious world building, and subscribe for the next episode. Dutch Dike Wardens who audit the sea with ledgers. End screen rolling now. Pick your next route.